Okay, this is for Thursday, March 8th. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 42. So, although Chapter 42 isn't one of the main systems that we're supposed to learn, remember we have to definitely go over the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system. The big thing that we need to look at here is about the gas exchange. We're going to do a quick little thing where we'll look at some of the cells for the immune system, but the whole big thing is that we're looking at gas exchange and how things are moving throughout the body in a animal. So as we said before, it's important for every organism to be able to exchange materials with its environment. It has to be able to bring in the nutrients and let out the waste. And so when we think about gas exchange, the big thing we need to make sure that we have exchanging is, of course, we need to bring oxygen into the organism for cellular respiration, and we need to pass out the carbon dioxide that was a waste from cell respiration. And so exchanges will actually occur at that cellular level, so it's kind of important that when we look at bigger organisms, we have some type of system to bring the gas to the cellular level. But when we think about unicellular organisms, it's usually going to occur directly with the environment, just through the plasma membrane. So as we said a second ago, if it's a multicellular organism, the direct exchange with the environment traditionally is not possible. So there must be some type of system built in within the organism to allow for this gas exchange. So for aquatic organisms, we see gills. I think you guys have seen those gills before. These are just extensions of plasma membrane extending out from the body, and they have a blood supply that allows for the oxygen to be taken up and the carbon dioxide to be released out. And then we also have to have some type of internal transport, some way that we can bring this gas throughout the body. And traditionally, that's the blood supply that allows that to happen. It's usually blood and whatnot that transports these resources throughout the body. And then when we think about animals that are not aquatic, usually they have lungs, which gills and lungs are very similar. Gills are on the outside, but lungs are on the inside. As we said before, small and or thin organisms are able to exchange materials directly with the surrounding media. So usually these, like the hydra that have a 2-cell thick membrane with the gastrovascular cavity, those organisms don't usually need to have some big transport system because of the fact that the gastrovascular cavity is important for that distribution of these resources. But in most animals, we have some type of transport system that will connect the organs of exchange with the body cells. And so that usually involves the open or closed circulatory systems. And then the more complex organisms have, of course, this internal transport system that we talked about a second ago, which was the circulatory system. So as I mentioned, a lot of our simple organisms, like our cnidarians would be like your jellyfish or your hydra. They have a body wall that's only 2 cells thick, which we saw in the previous previous chapters. And that encloses this thing called the gastrovascular cavity. The gastrovascular cavity is important for digestion as well as the distribution of nutrients throughout the body. As I said on the slide, it functions in both the digestion and the distribution of these substances. And so examples of cnidarians would be, of course, your jellies or your jellyfish. And then another example would be flatworms. And they have, of course, they're worms that are quite flat and so they're quite thin. So they have a large surface area to volume ratio to allow them to exchange the nutrients with the environment. So here you can see our jellyfish. The jellyfish has that gastrovascular cavity, as well as you can see the planera, which is a flatworm. Both of these do have that gastrovascular cavity to allow for the distribution of nutrients without an internal transport system. So organisms that are a little bit more complex, they either could have an open or a closed circulatory system. Open means that the circulatory fluid leaves the vessels and is in the body cavities, while the closed system remains, the circulatory fluid remains within the blood vessels. And so there's 3 main components. You have circulatory fluid, which would be your blood or your hemolymph. If we're looking at an open circulatory system, it's the hemolymph. If we're looking at a closed circulatory system, then this would be the blood. It has to have some set of tubes, so these would be the blood vessels that are allowing the blood throughout the body. And then it also needs to have some type of muscular pump, which would be your heart. Now, organisms can have more than one pump, and then these tubes can actually open up into a body cavity. And so we're going to look at those now. So here we can see the example of an open circulatory system. In the open circulatory system, you can see that there are blood vessels, and these blood vessels are going to allow the blood to leave the heart and come out here into the body cavity. And then there are blood vessels that will take the blood back into the heart. But because of the fact that the blood leaves these vessels and it mixes with the interstitial fluid, we can't call that blood. So instead we call this hemolymph, which is kind of this blood-like fluid. Versus in our closed system, the blood remains within these tubes and kind of sticks around in there. And so this would be the blood because it never mixes with the interstitial fluid, so it remains blood. So when we look here, we can see that there are different circulations that you could have. So if we were talking about a single circulation, like what we see in the bony fish, the rays, and the sharks, they're going to have a two-chambered heart. One chamber is the atrium. This is where the blood will pool as it enters the heart. And then you'll have the ventricle, which is where the blood will get pumped out of the heart from. And there's only going to be two capillary beds. There's going to be the gills, where it's going to pick up the oxygen, and then the systemic, which is where the oxygen is going to get dropped off at the different body cells. Okay, and so with this, because of the fact that we don't go to the lungs and then directly to the body parts, and we go to the gills instead, we see a single circulation. It goes in one single loop. Now, while I'm on the slide, I want to go ahead and mention something. The deoxygenated blood appears blue in these diagrams, and oxygenated blood appears red in these diagrams. But your blood is never blue. So if you look at your arm, you kind of can see the blue kind of vessels coming through. That's just due to the fraction of light. Your blood is always red. It's just a deeper, darker red depending on if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. So when we look at our amphibians, our reptiles, our mammals, you'll notice they have a double circulation. That means that there's actually two loops in which the blood is going to leave the heart and go and pick up oxygen, return to the heart, and then go leave the heart to drop off the oxygen at the systemic capillaries and then return back to the heart. So there's actually two loops at play with our double circulation. Now it is important to kind of look at the heart and see how the heart's a little different. So if you notice here with the amphibians, there's actually two atria. So here's one atrium and here's the other atrium. But there's only one ventricle. And so what happens is the blood is either going to leave the heart and go pick up oxygen at the lungs and the skin capillaries, or it's going to leave the heart and go down to the systemic capillaries, which means that this blood is not 100% saturated with oxygen because of the fact that we have deoxygenated and oxygenated blood mixing together before it leaves to go off to its different areas. Okay, versus our reptile, you'll see that now we have two atria, two atria, and we have two ventricles. But there's this hole right here that allows a little bit of mixing of that blood. And so we do see that it's not nearly as efficient as the mammals and the birds, but it is becoming more efficient. And then we look at mammals and birds, we see that we have two atria and two ventricle, and we do have two actual full tracts. The right side of the heart is going to move up into the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then the left side of the heart is going to pump the blood to the systemic capillaries, which is your body. So as I mentioned before, the cardiac muscle cells are self-excitable. You don't have to have the heart in a body. It doesn't have to be connected to the brain in order for the heart to pump. It'll pump on its own for about, I believe, 4 hours. That's kind of one of the reasons why you can chop off a chicken's head and they'll keep running even though they have no head. Because of the fact that the heart is still pumping, and so the organism is still getting blood and is still able to move throughout the body. So there's a couple different nodes that we have within the heart. You have the sinoatrial node, which would be the pacemaker. This determines the rate and the timing of it. And then you have your atrioventricular node. So you can kind of guess that the AV node is actually found between the atrium and the ventricle. And so this is just going to allow those impulses to kind of work together to pump the heart as one unit. Now, you all have been kids at one point in life, and you used to, I assume, play with the hose. And so when you've got a hose just kind of letting water out, and then you stick your thumb over the end of it, you'll notice that the pressure of the water increases. Why? Because you've given that water a smaller area at which to come out of the end of the hose. And so the same idea applies to your blood vessels, okay? And so your blood pressure has a lot to do with how much blood is being sent out, as well as the resistance due to the arteries. So if we go through vasoconstriction, we're seeing that our blood vessels are getting smaller, and because they're getting smaller, it's going to cause there to be less surface area, and so we increase the blood pressure. So the pressure is going to increase within your blood. And then if we see vasodilation, we'll see that the blood vessels get larger, and because the blood vessels get larger, there's an increase of surface area, which causes your blood pressure to actually drop or fall. So when there isn't enough oxygen getting to the head, oftentimes fainting can occur. Well, this isn't really a problem with us as humans because of the fact that our neck isn't very long. But if you think about a giraffe that has this really, 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 really long neck, it's going to have a higher systolic pressure, the pressure of the blood leaving the heart, in order for it to pump against gravity all the way up into the head. So you probably notice that giraffes don't stand perfectly up with their head all the way to the ceiling all the time. They usually have kind of more of a slouched look because of the fact that it decreases the amount of pressure needed to get all the way up to their head. And we also see that blood is going to move through our veins with small muscle contraction. So there's these little valves inside of your blood vessels, and the valves are going to kind of stop the blood from going backwards. And so the blood is able to come up from your legs to your back to your heart because of this small muscle contraction that kind of pushes the blood back up. As well as when you move, you're going to contract your muscles, which is also going to help to push that blood. So as I said before, it's important for gas exchange and exchange of various nutrients to occur within our blood vessels. And so the gas exchange and all the other exchanges of nutrients don't occur in the arteries and the veins. It actually occurs in this area called the capillaries. And so what ends up happening is that you have your blood and all of your stuff inside of the blood vessel, inside of your capillary, okay? And because of the pressure, we're going to push out a lot of the fluids, which also has a lot of the solutes in it, into this interstitial fluid. And so the interstitial fluid is just that fluid that the cells are bathed in, which will allow the cells to take up any of those nutrients. Okay, and then because now there's a higher pressure in this interstitial fluid, we're going to see that there's also going to be a movement back in with any of the waste and whatnot. So as I said before, our invertebrates have an open circulatory system, which means that their blood is actually hemolymph, and it's not different than the interstitial fluid, because hemolymph is where the blood and interstitial fluid has mixed together, which creates that hemolymph. But blood has several different components. You've got, of course, your erythrocytes, which would be your red blood cells. You have your leukocytes, which would be your white blood cells. And then, of course, you have platelets. And all of these are suspended within this liquid called plasma. So plasma is about 90% water. And so when you think about it, you're kind of thinking about all the different solutes that are within that plasma. So like our dissolved ions, like our electrolytes, like sodium and potassium and calcium and all these different essential ions. We also have a lot of proteins within there. And all of this is going to help with the blood pH. As we said before, you have carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion that are helping to keep your blood at approximately 7.4 pH. You also have a lot of proteins that help to keep up that osmotic pressure. It helps to keep your blood vessels isotonic to the rest of the body so that you're not going to see this great take up or loss of water. And then, of course, there's the blood vessels, the plasma proteins are going to help with the viscosity, so how thick is the blood. And then also we see that these can help with movement of lipids. Lipids are nonpolar, so they will not dissolve in this aqueous blood plasma, and so we have a lot of proteins that help to move the lipids throughout your blood vessels, as well as it helps with immunity because we'll have macrophages and leukocytes and all these other white blood cells. And then of course our platelets will help with our blood clotting. So as I said before, there's a couple different cell elements that you have within the blood plasma. Your red blood cells are called erythrocytes, and they're going to transport oxygen throughout the body. They have a protein called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is going to bind to that oxygen, which will allow the red blood cells to transport that oxygen throughout the body. Your white blood cells, called your leukocytes, are in charge of kind of the defense, the immunity in a way in your body. And we're going to look a lot more at these leukocytes when we get into chapter 43. And then of course you have your platelets, which their whole job is to help with blood clotting. So if you've fallen down and you skinned your knee, their job is to seal the breakage in the blood vessels to stop the blood from leaving your blood vessels so you don't bleed out. It also helps with the clotting of that blood to stop the blood from leaving. So here you see your erythrocytes. This is going to be our red blood cells, and if you notice they have kind of this circular concave structure. They have that circular structure, and it's also concave, so we also see that it's kind of broken in. That's because these cells have no nucleus and no mitochondria, and they pretty much don't have any of the organelles, because we want to have as much space as possible, as much surface area as possible to transport the oxygen throughout the body. And as I mentioned before, they have this protein called hemoglobin. And that hemoglobin contains iron, and then the oxygen binds to that hemoglobin to allow the blood vessel to transport oxygen throughout the body. Here we see the 5 main types of our leukocytes. We're going to look at these a lot more in depth when we get into chapter 43. But you have your monocytes, you have your neutrophils, your basophils, your eosinophils, and of course your lymphocytes. Their main job is to function with phagocytizing bacteria, so they go through phagocytosis and engulf this bacteria or various debris, and then they can also produce antibodies which will help to attack different pathogens. And so some of them are found inside of your circulatory system, some of them are found outside the circulatory system, and many of them can escape the circulatory system to move out, to defend your body, and then they'll come back into the blood vessels. And of course, last but not least, you have your platelets. Platelets are just fragments of cells, and their main job is to function in blood clotting. We talked back in chapter 14, maybe 15, about the hemophilia, which is a sex-linked disorder, and it has to do with that the organisms don't have the appropriate clotting factors. And so the signals that are going to bind to the platelets to cause them to clot, the individuals with hemophilia do not have these clotting factors, thus they don't get the signal, thus the platelets don't clot, thus these individuals could bleed out. So as I said before, there's a lot of different ways that gas exchange can occur. The main point of gas exchange is to bring the oxygen into the cells for cellular respiration, and then to dispose of the carbon dioxide that was a waste from cell respiration. So if we're looking at a single cell organism, it just passes straight through the membrane. If we're looking at amphibians, they usually can do it straight through their epidermis or their skin, okay? Same thing with our echinoderms. They're able to go straight through their skin. Insects use these little tubes called trachea. Fishes are able to do it through their gills. And of course, mammals are going to go through their lungs. So as we've talked about before, everything is going to go from high to low. So when we think about these gases, we're looking at their partial pressures. So the partial pressure is just the pressure exerted by that gas when there's a mixture of gases. And so if there is a region of higher partial pressure, the gas is going to move from there into a region that has a lower partial pressure. So when we think about our lungs, okay, and when you breathe in, there's going to be a low partial pressure of oxygen within your blood vessels, and there'll be a high partial pressure of oxygen in the air that you've just breathed in, which causes the oxygen to leave your lungs and move into the blood vessel. Now, that same blood vessel has a high partial pressure for carbon dioxide, while the air you just breathed in has a low partial pressure for carbon dioxide. And that causes the carbon dioxide to leave the blood vessel and move into the air within your lungs, so you'll then breathe it out. So depending on the organism, animals can either use air or water as their source of oxygen. Okay, and so in a given volume, there's less oxygen available in water than there is in air. That's why a lot of times you'll see in tanks, there's a lot of like little air bubbles that are being pumped from the bottom, is so that they can increase the amount of gas dissolved in that water. And so by being land animals, we actually have a better ability to get to the oxygen. And so the animals that live in the water have to have an efficient system to allow them to gain as much oxygen as possible. So when we looked before at thermoregulation, we talked about that the organisms were going to have a high amount of heat leaving the body in the arteries. And then as it moved farther away, as the blood moved farther away from the body, it cooled off because it was heating the incoming blood. Well, the same kind of idea is going to take place here when we look at our countercurrent exchange of oxygen between the water and the gills. So apparently I got ahead of myself, and we're going to have to look at that countercurrent exchange in just a moment. So when we look at these respiratory surfaces, animals have to have a large moist respiratory surface. Yes, the lungs inside of your body are moist. There's actually a chemical called surfactant that actually inhibits your alveoli, which are the little sacs inside of your lungs, from completely compressing. So when you breathe out all the air that's in your lungs, you actually still have air in your lungs. So it's kind of cool, but there's also moist. And so that way it can help with the passage of oxygen and other gases between the cells. And so gas exchange will occur by diffusion. It goes from where it's high to where it's low. And then the respiratory surface can vary based on the organism. So we could either do the skin. And so if you think about amphibians, those amphibians are usually really moist, right? If you ever touch the skin of a lizard, it's usually kind of wet. Earthworm, same idea. And the reason why is because of the fact that they have to have that moist surface. Okay. We also talk about the gills. The gills have to be, of course, bathed in water. If you take the fish out of the water, it usually is going to move a lot. Yes, because it's being taken, but also because it can't breathe. You've just taken away from all of its oxygen. Trachea we'll see within our insects. These are little tubes that go down into the individual cells. And of course, lungs found inside of most mammals. And so it's going to be just like this internal respiratory surface. So here you can see our gills. They're usually just outfoldings of the body that create a kind of a large surface area for gas exchange. So here you can see the little gills for the marine worm. Here you can see the gills for the crayfish. And then here you can see the gills for this sea star, which is the echinoderm. So when you think about something breathing, breathing isn't what you think it is. Breathing has to do with that you are bringing gas into the body and then releasing it back out. Okay, but ventilation is really what we're looking for. Okay, we want to see how the respiratory medium moves over the respiratory surface. So the medium would be where is the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. Okay, so when we think about us and we think about our lungs, we're looking at the air and how it passes and moves over the alveola, which would be our respiratory surface. When we think about aquatic animals and looking at their gills, we're talking about the respiratory medium being the water and how it moves the water over the gills, which would be the respiratory surface. And so if you've ever watched a fish, they always have this little thing moving in front of their mouth or behind their mouth. That's called the operculum. And so what happens is it's constantly moving the water over the gills to allow them to ensure that they can keep bringing in oxygen. Okay, and fish use this thing called a countercurrent exchange system. Okay, and we looked at countercurrent exchange and we looked at the thermoregulation and we looked at heat exchange. Well, the same idea is going to occur here, but now we're going to look at oxygen and how the oxygen is going to get passed from the high area of the water to the low area of the blood. And so let's go look at that. So when we look at countercurrent exchange, we're going to see that the water is moving in this direction, while the blood is going to move in the opposite direction. So we're already seeing that countercurrent. Okay, and you're going to notice that the blood comes in contact with a higher concentration of oxygen every single point. And so because of the fact that every area where that blood comes in contact with the water, there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the water, it's going to cause the oxygen to move from the water into the blood vessel. So that way we're able to constantly gain oxygen, and so at the end of it, we'll have a high concentration of oxygen within our bloodstream. Now, the insects have an awkward system, and it's kind of weird, but what they have is this thing called a tracheal system. They have these small little tubes that penetrate their body, and the oxygen goes directly down the tube to the actual body cells. So here we can see that trachea, and it has all these different branches within it. You see all the branches. And it goes directly down to the cell, and then the gas exchange actually occurs between the trachea and the actual cells. So lungs, you guys are probably most kind of in tune with. This has to do with an infolding of the body surface. And so within your lungs, you have these little sacs called alveoli. And so within the different alveoli, you're going to see that the carbon dioxide is in a high concentration inside of the blood, so it passes out, while the oxygen is in a high concentration in the air, so it passes into the blood. So that way you're able to release the carbon dioxide and pick up the oxygen. And that brings us to the end of chapter 42. I do want you guys to work on the bioflix on gas exchange just so you can kind of get a better understanding of how this whole thing works, to make sure that you understand the gas exchange that is occurring within animals.